Okay, let's talk a little bit about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is that period after the Civil War comes to a conclusion. And it's all about bringing those southern states, those former Confederate states, back into the fold. And how are we going to do that? And obviously, this is how complicated by the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln initially wants to bring the southern states back in very quickly. He advocates for a 10% loyalty oath. So 10% of the population says, like, I'm loyal to the United States of America, and they're kind of good to go. He does not want to punish anybody, particularly those Confederate leaders. He does want to abolish slavery, and he does want to provide rights for African Americans. This was his initial plan. Now, this is not the plan shared by a lot of people. There's a lot of radical Republicans that are all about punishing, like, we won the war, like, now you're going to pay for it for trying to break free. So Lincoln's initial plan was this. It was a very quick, like, readmitting states into the Union and kind of saying, we kind of forgive you, or let's move on, but we are going to provide African American rights. There is a counter plan. Those radical Republicans in Congress, called the Wade Davis bill, sponsored by a couple of senators, one from Ohio, wanted 50% loyalty oath before they could move forward. Wants to have a military government present in Confederate states. Also wants to punish those leaders that kind of led the Confederacy. Like, they've lost and they should pay for losing. So that means, like, not part of, like, any further leadership. So maybe taking their land away, that sort of thing. Now, when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson takes over. Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, a lot of Southerners are like, all right, we have one of our own. He's going to be more sympathetic because Andrew Johnson was a racist. I mean, there's no doubt. He didn't necessarily look to give African Americans a lot of rights. He owned slaves, all things that were, not kind of going along with Abraham Lincoln's vision of this idea. His plan was a little different. Initially, he surprised some people. Initially, he did want to admit the states back quickly, as did Abraham Lincoln. So he almost sided with that. That was surprised a lot of folks. What his plan ended up being kind of split the difference between the radicals and Lincoln's. He did want to have a loyalty oath. You had to take that loyalty oath before you could vote on your new revised state constitution. That had to be approved by Congress before you get readmitted. So the citizens, if I didn't give my loyalty to the United States of America, I couldn't have my voice heard. I couldn't vote. So I had to prove that I was loyal before I could vote in any elections, particularly for that Constitution, like I mentioned. Confederate leaders were excluded. However, members of the planter class, members of the Confederate leadership could advocate to Johnson to be pardoned. If they so wished. Now, Johnson, if you know his background, Johnson was very poor. He had a little animosity towards those that had more than him, so this was a little bit his way of, like, look, I've ascended to the office of president, now you're going to kind of come and beg me to get your rights back. How do you like that? Tables have turned. So he does advocate that a little bit. His plan also advocates for having a provisional government in place in these southern states. So that means a government that's put in place by the North. In order, before they have the loyalty oath, before the state constitution gets up and running, the North is going to put their own governments in to kind of run things. Obviously, that's never a great answer to people that live there. They want their own to kind of make the calls on the rules and regulations and how they're going to live their lives. So provisional governments usually are not met with a lot of, like, yay. They're met with some animosity and some negative feelings, for sure. All right, just how this works in the South. So with the plan for Reconstruction in place, Andrew Johnson, kind of sets that down. Sends down people from the government. There's people, obviously, from the North that are down there to make sure that a lot of these plans are followed through on, that elections are fair, that they're doing what they have to do. Again, this usually doesn't set well with people that live in the region, whether it's in the South or whether we're talking about for world history, like a country that's been overtaken. They don't love, again, that provisional government in there. In the South, they come up with ideas of black codes, which is slightly similar to like the slave codes that they had. It does allow the slaves that were married to legally become husband and wife, which created some interesting situations for couples that were married and then split up because the one of the spouses was traded to maybe another family, another plantation. That person maybe would have married again. So now that there's this freedom, now all of a sudden I might have two wives, and hey, they both show up, and it's like, ooh, which one's right? So it did provide some of those situations, but the black codes were put in place to, provide some instruction for black citizens. That did give a few rights, but there was a lot of restrictions. So this was kind of the South's way of, you got freedom, but we're going to try to limit that freedom as much as we can. They were able to work in agriculture, but if they wanted to work in something else, they had to get like a license to do that. So there was a lot of limits on what they can do. This was kind of their way of fighting, the white citizens in the South, their way of fighting back. They didn't really love it. Elections in the South. Excuse me really quick. All right, elections in the South. Absolutely, when they came back and they took place. Remember, under Johnson's Reconstruction plan, those Confederate leaders were not allowed to run for office. Well, in a lot of southern states, they're like, we're going to do what we want to do. They were absolutely Confederate leaders, one of which was the vice president of the Confederacy, a guy by the name of Alexander Stephens, who ran for the Senate in Georgia and won. Andrew Johnson caves pretty hard on this. He's like, well, whatever. Like, let him. That's fine. He can do whatever he wants to do. So he caves in on this. I'm sure setting a little bit of a precedent for the South, thinking that we can kind of do whatever it is we want to do. Andrew Johnson and the Congress also had a very volatile relationship around this time. So not only is the South kind of pushing him around, like, is he going to follow through on some of these Reconstruction plans? He has some major divide among Congress. Those radical congressmen don't love Johnson because they know he's a racist, and they know that he doesn't really want to protect the rights of African Americans. So there's a lot of rift there. There is an incredible amount of animosity between Congress and Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson fired cabinet secretaries, which were some of his advisors, heads of departments, pretty frequently, and that's perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional to do. Well, Congress makes a law that basically says, like, if you're going to fire one of your cabinet secretaries, you have to get approval from Congress. That is completely unconstitutional, but they made that law. Andrew Johnson, not being able to resist, decides, like, I'm going to fire who I want. And he fires his Secretary of, I believe, War, which causes Congress to say, you violated that law. We are going to impeach you. So they impeach President Andrew Johnson. Remember, impeachment doesn't mean kicking somebody out of office. Impeachment just means they've done something wrong. Now, there's a second part of the impeachment process after you've been impeached, where you have a trial within the Senate that determines if you're going to get kicked out of office. So Andrew Johnson just has this terrible relationship with Congress. Every time they pass a law, Andrew Johnson vetoes it, and Congress says, like, whatever. They override his veto, which is extremely hard to do. Like, you really have to get a lot of unity in Congress to override a veto. It doesn't happen super frequently. It happened all the time with Andrew Johnson. There was one unifying factor in Congress. They all hated Andrew Johnson. Congress has the ability also to name the number of, like, Supreme Court justices or federal judges. They can increase the number, and they can also decrease the number. So when Andrew Johnson was president, people don't really know this. When Andrew Johnson was president, he had a couple Supreme Court justices that retired or died. And instead of letting Andrew Johnson pick the replacement, as is, the protocol as established by the Constitution, Congress took their constitutional right and said, we are going to reduce the number in the Supreme Court by 1. So every time somebody resigned, they went down from 9 to 8, and then I think from 8 to 7. As soon as Andrew Johnson left office, Congress instantaneously move that number back to 9 again, saying, I guess we'll go back to the way we always had it. Clearly, they just did it because they didn't want Andrew Johnson to pick a successor. So Andrew Johnson gets impeached. The trial of his impeachment is a circus, an absolute circus. Like I said, it's really not very constitutional, the reason they're impeaching him. It's pretty much a sham. He was a bad president, but there was no legal reason to impeach him. And I guess some common sense ruled the day, and by a very narrow margin, they voted to not remove him from office. So he is indeed a president that has been impeached, just like Donald Trump, just like Bill Clinton. All three of them never had to be kicked, got to the point where they got kicked out of office. All three went to the Senate and they were voted to stay. Okay, so that happens. During this time period in Reconstruction, let's talk about African Americans. After the Civil War, they're given their freedom. So, yay, that's good. But what's not so good is, what do you do? Like, throughout their lives as slaves, they haven't been given access to education. So there's some issues there. There are 3 amendments that are passed that hope to give rights. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th abolishes slavery. 15th Amendment gives African American males the right to vote. And the 14th Amendment, that one right in the middle there, that 14th Amendment kind of establishes what the rights are to be a citizen. And this is really aimed at the states, so those southern states didn't take advantage of African Americans. Voting. African Americans initially, with the 15th Amendment, are given the right to vote. And right after the Civil War, this is almost like the heyday of African Americans for voting. Like, they were given the ability to vote. Once the North leaves the South and Reconstruction ends, there's a lot of things that are put in place to stop African Americans from voting that are really going to be there until the 1960s. So that first initial wave is almost the best bet African Americans get. Not saying it was good, it clearly was not, but it almost was the best deal they get. It gets a lot worse for them when the North leaves, and then it's not going to, and then it gradually kind of gets a little bit better. They have something called the Freedmen's Bureau that helped look out for African Americans' rights, make sure that people weren't taken advantage. They left town in the 1870s. So again, once they leave, it's not good for African Americans. African Americans are really centered around schools and churches. A lot of what they do is kind of centered around churches. Now they're subjected to a lot of violence, lynchings, beatings, all of that pretty commonplace in the South, particularly when the Northerners leave. Now, what do African Americans do for a living? Really, all they know is farming. So most of them do kind of go back to a system that's almost looks a lot like slavery. They start sharecropping, so basically renting land, and the owner would take part of the profit, and usually they charge them for like materials, so much so that they become indebted and they really can't leave the land. They're kind of stuck there, like they would as a slave. The other thing that happens is the Democratic Party becomes major power of the South. The Mississippi Plan is in place, and what that basically is any kind of violence that they need, they are going to carry it out. They're going to do whatever they have to do to make sure the Democratic Party wins back the government, and they absolutely do that. And they feel like the South has been redeemed. The Democratic Party also creates the Ku Klux Klan, which is the terrorist kind of wing of the party that is going to carry out some violence to make sure that things kind of run the way they want it to. Now, the end of Reconstruction really coincides with the election of 1876. Samuel Tilden runs against Rutherford B. Hayes. Nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, so it goes to the tiebreaker. And nobody can win the tiebreaker. They keep voting and voting and voting, and nobody wins. So eventually, Rutherford B. Hayes makes this deal, the Compromise of 1877, which basically says that he is going to pull out all the federal government employees from the South and recognize the Democratic governments as being legit in exchange for those people voting for him for president of the United States. Everybody agrees, so Reconstruction essentially is ended. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. The Democrats take control of the South. This idea of redeemers redeeming like the South kind of takes hold, and things get a whole lot worse for African Americans. This is when the racism kicks in, and it's not really great for them. But Reconstruction officially is ended at this point in time.